Asyle, the engineer, and the island. Week 44, Day 1. It was overcast today, and I expected the weather to start getting worse later this week, so I spent the morning foraging and then working on making paper. It's nice that I have something special to put on it now, and that made the work a bit easier and more fun. In between loading and unloading cellulose and alkali, I did some sketching and writing for my tabletop Pokemon game. That was pretty much all I did until the end of the day, and while I'm not sorry that I made the extra paper, I realized when I started getting ready for bed that I probably could have spent that time a bit more productively by preparing more pipe for the vortex drill while I was in the workshop. Week 44, Day 2. It was overcast again today, which I wasn't really expecting. Nevertheless, I kept to my plans and spent the day blasting for copper. I found another particularly deep vein in one of the shaft walls that I spent most of the day blasting deeper and deeper. At the end of the day, I loaded it all into the ore crusher and checked the weather for tomorrow. According to my instruments, I'm in luck, as the pressure is starting to rise again, which means I can probably do some smelting and finally start testing this vortex drill. Week 44, Day 3. It was a pretty clear day today, so after my morning chores, I was excited to start smelting, pulling the copper into fine wire, and wrapping it around my motor core. I finally took all of the equipment I needed down to the shaft for installation and testing, in particular several large pots of water to fill up the reservoir, which was pretty exhausting. I stopped for lunch and a breather before starting construction. Instead of mounting the motor directly to the shaft of the Tesla turbine, I took the time to build a series of wheels of different sizes and a belt to connect them and keep tension on them. It works kind of like the chains and gears on a bicycle to control the speed and torque on the motor and turbine, but with a twist. I built a little flyball governor on the tension wheel so that the faster the whole apparatus spins, the higher the gear setting becomes, so the motor will always be turning the turbine as fast as it safely can for the amount of torque that it can output. When I finished building the belt train, I started assembling the turbine. I had the main axis pointing down into the well, where it'll basically always be sucking up water through its shaft, with the motor and trinity of pulleys sticking up out of the top. The halves of the turbine casing themselves I glued together with latex and held in place with bamboo cord around the turbine discs. I then built some piping out the side of the turbine to fit onto the outside of the drill pipe. This consisted basically of a cap or sleeve with a hole in it where high-pressure water would enter the borehole, flowing down around the outside of the return pipe. The water and sand slurry will come back up and out the hole in the center of the sleeve through the return pipe passing through it, also allowing the return pipe to be extended easily without having to take the whole apparatus apart as it drills down. A weight on the return pipe will help drive it slowly into the ground against the force of the water pressure pushing it up. After that, I just needed to stick the return pipe into the vortex drill head, install it in the aforementioned sleeve, and drill a pilot hole. When I was done, I filled the reservoir with water, and although it was getting late, I couldn't resist testing it, so I got a battery and started the motor up. It choked and sputtered a bit at first, and I had to run to find a bunch of cord and rocks to weight down the sleeve and keep it from popping out of the hole, but once I finished tweaking, everything seemed to be running as smoothly as it could for the monstrosity that it was, and water came squirting and dribbling out of the center pipe as planned. After keeping an eye on it for several minutes, I measured the length of the pipe and eventually concluded that it was definitely going down, and a little bit of sand was coming out of the center pipe with the water. I was somewhere between elated, expecting something else to go wrong at any moment, and too tired to care. Call it cautiously optimistic on the whole. To avoid wasting power, though, I tied one of the cables to the center pipe such that it would break the motor connection if/when the pipe extended downward as far as it could go and needed to have a new pipe added to it. I then headed back out of the cave and got ready for bed. Week 44, Day 4. It was raining pretty heavily when I got up in the morning, probably a result of yesterday's sun warming up the area all of a sudden, but I didn't really care. I immediately headed back down into the cave to check on the drill. I was half expecting it to be stuck halfway down and the battery to be drained, or something else to have gone wrong, like the turbine discs having shattered. But everything appeared to be in order. The pipe was all the way down, and the power had shut off, as planned. I replaced the battery, taking the old one back to the lab to recharge, and prepared a few adjustments. I built a little tripod and sleeve for the center pipe, to help keep it straight during drilling, as well as a bit of cloth to filter the water entering the turbine, so it won't suck up sand from the bottom of the well, causing damage. Next, I wanted a way to make the pipes add onto each other automatically, so I wouldn't have to come and check on it every day. The simplest solution would have been to just connect all the pipes ahead of time and let them reel slowly down into the hole. They were long enough and flexible enough for that. The problem with that, though, is that the center pipe was also the water outlet, and if it's too long, it'll have too much resistance to flow, putting too much back pressure on the turbine and ruining the drill's cavitation process. This reminded me to pull out the drill and check for damage. Fortunately, my math was apparently accurate, and it wasn't particularly damaged at all. The majority of the cavitation must have occurred at the edge of the hole, where the water was forced to flow faster, and less so closer to the center, where the drill head was. A small difference, but it was enough. Back to the pipe issue, though. Normally, drilling rigs have pipes that screw onto each other while the drill is running, but I didn't really have that option. Mine basically relied on joints that squeezed together, and it wasn't really a problem for the return pipe, which was under considerably less pressure than the rest of the system. That by itself, however, gave me an idea, and I went back to the workshop, in the rain, to build a pair of wheels to sit on either side of the top of the tripod, with a frame and some cord under tension to keep them squeezed together. I made a belt to connect one of these wheels to the turbine, and the idea is that these wheels will not only provide a consistent downward force on the pipes, pushing the drill head into the ground instead of weights, but also, when the pipe has been pushed down as far as the wheels can push it, the wheels will grab onto the next pipe and push it into place, and the cycle should repeat. All the while, the center pipe will be open at one end and free to let water and sand leak out. It was a bit of a messy solution, but it was the best thing I could think of for the materials I had. So once I was done building and testing the apparatus, I built a large hopper to hold the pipes I'd prepared in a position where they could be grabbed by the wheels. Now it's starting to look like some kind of drilling platform, with a bunch of straws in it. When I was done making these adjustments, I started the drill again and made tweaks as needed to improve its performance. Now that it seems to have gotten itself entrenched and straightened out, it appears to be drilling much faster, about 1 centimeter per minute, which I'm frankly a little astonished by. I guess that's what happens, though, when you're constantly hammering a rock surface with thousands of tiny explosions. Or perhaps if I was using the same amount of energy to run a diamond drill from the motor directly, or maybe vaporizing the rock with a laser. Energy is energy. The trick is how you use it, and one way may produce more useful work than another, or waste less energy as heat. That's how you define efficiency. Unlike a drill or laser, most of the energy going into the drill is being used to pop the rocks, with any waste going into heating the water by friction, which shouldn't be very much. Getting back to the numbers, I remembered from Journey to the Center of the Earth that the temperature of the Earth's interior rises by 25 to 30 degrees centigrade for every kilometer you dig down. If I want this turbine to generate geothermal energy, I need to dig down at least 3 kilometers. For perspective, the Kola Super Deep borehole went down about 12 kilometers. 25% of that is no mean feat I'm trying to accomplish here, especially with bamboo and clay. At the same time, however, I'm also sitting on top of a hot spot in the Earth's crust, so I may not have to dig that far down at all. There's just no way to tell at this point. At my current digging rate, however, it would still take me up to 200 days to reach the required depth at which water would start to boil, and that's not taking into account the rise in pressure with depth. I really needed it to drill faster than that, so I racked my brain for a minute. Cavitation is basically caused by water flowing very fast past a static surface. The water right next to that surface sticks to it, creating a shear force between the fast and slow-moving water, and more importantly, a pressure difference, which causes bubbles to form on the surface. Eventually, those bubbles get too big for the pressure difference to support, and they collapse, creating a supersonic jet of water that rams into the surface, taking a chunk of that surface away with it. Those bubbles are basically storing energy from the water and releasing it explosively, almost like a spring. And I can imagine a substance that's less viscous producing weaker bubbles, because they would store less energy. I couldn't make the water more viscous, because that would put more stress on the turbine, but I had an idea for something that might make the bubbles store more energy. I simply added a little bit of soap to the well, not enough to turn it into a big bubble fountain, which would be fun. But the idea is that this will help increase the surface tension of the water, making it easier for bubbles to form and remain stable for longer, thus storing more energy and hitting the rock harder. Finally, the addition of small particles of rock or dust to those implosion jets will also help erode the rock's surface, like shooting it with thousands of tiny bullets. So I added just a little bit of clay dust to the water to muddy it up and see if it helped. I watched the drill for a while, and it eventually bumped up the drilling speed to 4 centimeters per minute, which is frankly phenomenal from an objective standpoint. From a subjective one, though, it's still going to be a while before the drill bears any fruit. About 50 days, but that's still much better than 200. I think I can wait that long. In the meantime, I'm going to need a lot of bamboo pipes to dig down that far. If my bamboo pipes are 50 feet long at most, then I'm going to need 66 bamboo stalks per kilometer, or about 200 bamboo stalks in total. That'll come to about 4 stalks per day, and I can gather much more than that during the course of a daily foraging, even taking the rain into account, so this shouldn't be a bottleneck on the pump's performance. I doubt, however, that the batteries will be able to run continuously for 24 hours, but in a couple of weeks, that shouldn't be a problem anymore. I spent some time preparing extra pipes ahead of time from the bamboo I had stockpiled, and then stopped for lunch. Very satisfied with this progress, I got back to my Pokemon board game after lunch, putting a few finishing touches on the maps and cards. I focused mostly on the Gen 1 Pokemon, because those were the ones I had the easiest time remembering, and I didn't replicate Pokemon Red perfectly, instead setting the story in an earlier time period from the games, and drawing the various buildings in the style of more traditional Japanese architecture. At the end of the day, I played a few rounds and tweaked the rules to balance it as I went. It was very similar to the original Pokemon game in many ways. You roll dice and move a number of spaces on the map grid, and depending on where you stop, you draw a card from the Pokemon deck to start a combat encounter. During combat, you choose attacks that damage the target or inflict status effects, and when it's the enemy's turn, you roll dice to see what attacks they use on you. Instead of tracking XP, though, I just kept track of each Pokemon's wins, and used that as a currency at gyms to unlock new attack options on the cards or permanently level up the Pokemon with evolution. At least it makes the gyms useful, kind of like a shop, which is a problem I always had with the traditional Pokemon gyms. You don't actually use them as a gym, that is, a place to practice getting stronger. You just walk in, beat up everyone's pets, and get a commemorative pin for it. Anyway, it's decent as a board game, but it kind of feels like I could do more with it. Maybe make it more like D&D, where you can have random quests from villagers, giving the imagination some gaps to fill in, and make the game feel a bit more like a real world. Maybe I'll look more into that tomorrow. I've certainly got plenty of time to play around with these sorts of things while I wait for the drill to work its magic, especially if the rain keeps up. I changed out the drill battery before going to bed. Week 44, Day 5. Still raining, though not as hard as yesterday. That meant I was stuck indoors all day, but I had things to do to keep me occupied today. When I got up, I checked on the vortex drill first thing and changed out the battery. I could see there were a few bugs in the loading apparatus, and I made a few adjustments to keep them from happening again. Other than that, there was starting to be a buildup of sand in the reservoir, which would eventually displace all the water from it, so I scooped it out and took it to the ore centrifuge, just in case there was any useful metal ore in it. I wasn't expecting much besides volcanic basalt, however. I also checked the drill head again before it got too deep, to confirm that it wasn't wearing down. Otherwise I would have to regularly replace it, unloading and reloading kilometers of pipe on a daily basis. I did notice a little pitting on the drill head and replaced it, but I started to worry that this wasn't going to work after all. Then I got a clever idea and whipped up a quick bearing and small turbine blades and connected them between the drill head and the correction ring. The idea is that the bearing and the little turbine blades will cause the drill head to spin in the same direction as the water flow, thus reducing the shear forces on the water around its surface and therefore preventing cavitation. Brilliant! At that point, I decided to go check on my microbe cultures, which I had forgotten for the past several days. I was not surprised at all that the contents of the incubator smelled absolutely fetid. But what I was a little surprised at initially was that some of the cultures seemed to be gone, or at least to have stopped growing after a point. I expected them to basically take over the petri dishes completely, but I suppose the population crash isn't entirely surprising. Once they maxed out the number of bacteria that could fit on the petri dishes, or reached a certain population size, they all started dying. Not because the petri dish ran out of resources, as there was plenty of agar and oxygen for them, but because they became so densely packed together that it became easy for bacteriophages to propagate through the entire population. I checked the cultures under the microscope to confirm this, and although I couldn't actually see very much, because the bacterial cells were very small and almost transparent, I could make out the remains of where a lot of them used to be, almost reminiscent of strange, tiny cities abandoned after a zombie apocalypse, with only a handful of struggling survivors still roaming the ruins. I guess this is both a comforting and terrifying thought that, no matter the circumstances, when any species' population gets too large or too dense, Nature has built-in feedback controllers in the form of viruses and diseases to bring that population back into balance, so it doesn't destroy everything around it. Comforting to know that it works on disease-causing microorganisms, and terrifying to recognize that rule applies to humans too. All the more reason to live in the country, I suppose. And I suppose I'm at least safe from that sort of thing here, though not from death by other diseases like bacterial or fungal infections. This gave me an idea, however, for some new experiments. I've been doing a good job avoiding injuries with all the projects I've been working on here, especially when explosions and gunfights are taken into account. And every time I've gotten a cut or scrape, I've immediately dipped it in ethanol and covered it with cloth or latex to act as a band-aid, even though it hurts like a woodchuck. However, eventually I'm going to get seriously injured, and I'm probably going to get some kind of infection. I don't have access to antibiotics, and while I'm aware that certain species of mold can produce penicillin, I'm not sure how to extract or synthesize it from them. That level of chemistry is way out of my league. However, ever since germs started becoming immune to antibiotics, scientists have started looking into bacteriophage therapies as an alternative, because the phages will always be adapting under natural selection to get better at infecting bacteria and other microbes, no matter how much those microbes likewise adapt for greater immunity. Every single bacteria, paramecium, and fungus on this island has its own unique disease that it's vulnerable to, and by culturing those microbes to the point of collapse, while I may not be able to see the viruses, I'll know that they're in there, and I can cultivate them by feeding them new cultures, or keep them cold and dry in the cellar until I need them. This will certainly go a long way towards making me feel secure, without access to medical facilities. With that in mind, I started making some new cultures and saved the old ones somewhere cool, so I could try to save any viruses still in them, and see if they actually worked, or which viruses worked on which cultures. On that note, it was also nearly impossible for me to identify one culture from another, except by general shape and color, with or without a microscope. Most of them just formed a milky white or gray scum on the surface of my petri dishes. Normally in microbiological studies, scientists will use some sort of dye to stain the bacteria so they're easier to see. I know this process involves a dye and a fixer, and while I can remember that the process requires iodine as the fixer, I can't remember what the other compound is. I think I remember hearing that one of the first dyes for this sort of thing was developed from a certain kind of lichen, but there's no way I could identify it, let alone know the chemical steps to turn it into dye. I figured my only option at this point was to use some natural plant dyes and hope that one of them contained a useful stain that the bacteria would consume and accumulate, making them visible if I wash or dilute the rest of the stain off the petri dish. I got some plants from my various collections, like indigo, red pinecone, and just a few green leaves, and boiled them in different pots to make dyes that I can set aside for later. At the same time, I used the heat to run the autoclave and sterilize my petri dishes. Finally, I put on my diving suit and headed out to the reef to collect some algae, for two purposes. One was to collect more agar, which I boiled out of them when I got back, and the other was to collect iodine salts that the seaweeds accumulated from the seawater. I decanted the water from the agar solution for this, in addition to burning the seaweed to create soda ash. I then took the solution, put it in one of my small electrolysis pots with a zinc battery, and put it in the cellar next to one of the cooling elements, now noticeably cooler than usual since it's been raining. The idea here is that the solution is full of all sorts of potassium, sodium, chloride, and iodide salts, and if I electrolyze them, Hydroxides will form at the anode, while bubbles of chlorine, iodine, and oxygen gases will form at the cathode. The chlorine and oxygen will bubble and diffuse out of the solution, but if the iodine is kept cold, it won't evaporate, but remain in the solution, or even form purple crystals on the lid of the container if it's cold enough. Being back in the kitchen reminded me that I was late for lunch, so I ate and spent the remainder of the day working on my Pokemon game. Specifically, I added something I learned from D&D about random encounter tables, where you have a list of keywords and you roll dice to pick words from the table to help you figure out what the NPC is up to or what they want. Your imagination fills in the gaps. I spent some time working on this, basically just trying to think of as many random words as I could for the table, and playing a few of them to make sure they made sense. It was fun, and helped me flesh out the drawings a little, particularly of characters. However, as I noticed that I was starting to get an increasingly large stack of maps and cards, in addition to a growing rule book, I decided that it would be easier to manage if I basically bound the maps into the book and made some pockets on the inside of the cover for the various card stacks. I spent a couple of hours working on this, and even painting the cover so it all looked like one contiguous item that was meant to be together, and I liked it. I made notes on different exits of each map to turn to a different page to go to the next map area, and it kind of reminded me of a choose-your-own-adventure book, which made me love it even more, in addition to giving me ideas for other things I could make in my spare time this wet season. One thing's for sure, if I'm going to keep this up, I'm going to need more paper. Week 44, Day 6. The weather cleared today, and I had some ideas for what I wanted to use the solar kiln for while the sun was out. First, though, I checked on the vortex drill one last time to make sure the drill head wasn't wearing down, as it was taking longer and longer to extract all the pipe. This time there was no appreciable wear, so I cleared out the sand, changed out the battery, and added a little more water to the reservoir. I also checked on my iodine electrolysis pot, and while the solution wasn't concentrated enough to tell me if there was iodine in it just by looking at it, I dripped some onto a bit of taro and confirmed that iodine was present by the starch in the taro turning black where the solution touched it. For my main project today, however, I wanted to take advantage of the sunlight to do some glass blowing. Mostly, I wanted to make more equipment for microbiological experiments, more petri dishes and test tubes. However, in the vein of doing stuff just because it makes me happy, I wanted to make a bunch of glass bottles as well, and try making soda again. Perhaps I can use my microbiological equipment to isolate and selectively breed the yeasts necessary for proper carbonation this time. I began this project by making a few glass panels, most of which I set aside in case I needed them later, and some that I put in the drill press to grind into new petri dishes. Then I pulled some into tubes that I sealed on one end to form test tubes of a consistent diameter. I'm starting to get good at this. A few of the early ones turned out wonky though, so I tried instead blowing them into other pieces of glassware, like bottles and flasks. I then stopped for lunch before going into large-scale bottle production. I did my best to make sure the bottles had pretty thick walls, so they could withstand the moderate pressures of carbonation. I've seen people make bottles by hand on TV before, and imitated what I saw, rolling the hot glass on a flat stone to make them a consistent shape. It was critical that they have as close to a perfectly circular cross-section as possible to distribute the stresses of internal gas pressure evenly, and for the same reason, I made the bottoms of the bottles concave, like I've seen on Mom's wine bottles, or frankly like the glass panes of the underwater dome. Same principle behind both. By the end of the day, I was able to make about 10 bottles, which I thought was a good start for my own personal winery. I then tidied up after myself and got ready for bed. Week 44, Day 7. I was so busy making bottles yesterday that I forgot it would be Sabbath today. The week flies by when you're finally getting stuff done, I suppose. It was another sunny day, of course, and after changing out the Vortex drill battery and doing my morning chores, I transcribed my Bible recordings and listened to the sermon on the radio before going down to the dome to tend the garden, feed the sharks, and enjoy the view and elevated oxygen levels. After lunch, I decided to do a little light construction work and used some of the bamboo I collected this morning to construct a little wine rack down in the panic room for my bottles. I mostly just made a pair of rectangular frames with bamboo diagonals to hold the wine bottles, and designed it so that the back frame was offset a little bit downward from the front frame, so the bottles would sit on an incline, preferring to fall back against the wall rather than out onto the floor. When I was done assembling this frame, I varnished it and left it to dry. Somehow, it makes the panic room feel less panicky by adding something that represents mirth and celebration. Now it's less of a panic room and more of a wine cellar. At the end of the day, I relaxed by playing and tweaking my Pokemon game a little bit more. Sorry, I'm a bit busy right now. I'm trying to think of a wine joke to start the blooper reel. I'll call you back later. Asyle. Asyle. Wow, there was a bit of gravel in that one, wasn't there? Let's try again. Pushing the drill head into the ground instead of weights. Pushing the drill head down. Pushing the drill. Why are you having such trouble with this? Pushing the bit more productively, right? At my current digging rate, however, cavitation is basically caused by water flowing very cavitation is The idea is that the bearing and the little turbine blades will. The idea is that maybe I'll look more into that tomorrow, even though it hurts like a woodchuck. Every single bacteria, paramecium, and fungus on this island has its own unique. Every single Let's take a tick. So I ate and spent the rim. So I ate and. However, as I noticed that I was getting an increasingly large stack of as I know, I'm starting to get good at this. I'm starting to get good at this. I'm starting to get good at this. I'm starting to get you. Hey there. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. It's exciting to finally see the Vortex drill up and running, as well as a little nerve-wracking. But with any luck, I will soon have access to an unlimited supply of geothermal energy to power my base with. That'll take a while though, so if you want to see how my bacteriophage experiments progress while I wait, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as the next episode is ready. I appreciate you watching to the end of this one, though, since it tells the algorithm that you liked it, in addition to pressing the actual like button, and to share it with other people who watch the same stuff you do. But even though I'm not making these episodes for money, it would really help me out, more than anything else, if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, since the algorithm doesn't tend to push stuff that doesn't make ad revenue. And my interest in making these videos is mostly in finding other people who share my interests. On that note, if you'd like to share some of your thoughts, stories, and perspectives on the episode, feel free to share them in the comments section below. I would genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.